A self-described old tough country boy, Navy Lieutenant Shields Wilson weathered a number of tough situations early on in the Amphibious Corps. He nearly drowned during a training incident, and his ship survived a torpedo attack en route to England. As an officer aboard an LCVP landing craft vehicle personnel, his role on D-Day was to, quote, take troops to the beaches as fast as possible and return and get some more. The following footage is provided by the Library of Congress, and it's Shields Wilson talking about his experiences during World War II.
Well, we were talking about the day before we actually left Southampton Harbor when the Normandy invasion had been delayed. Of course, Eisenhower was the key on this for 24 hours. And somebody said, come here, Shields. I want you to listen to this woman. We've heard her before. And they on the radio, and they had nicknamed her German Lil, L-I-L. I mean, that's just a name that they knew it was coming from Germany. Mm-hmm. But she had a beautiful English accent. And this was Axis Sally, that people have heard of her now. But here was Axis Sally on its radio speaking to us Americans. You know, why are you Yankees? They always called us Yankees, you know, and there I was, a Southern bred and born guy. I didn't like that, but anyway, she said, why are you over here? Why don't you let these Brits fight their own battles? Why don't you go back home? And, you know, you don't need to do this. And then she sort of signed off saying, well, we know where you're coming and we'll be there to greet you. We'll see you tomorrow. Whew! Here I'd been told how secret all this was. Well, it tells you, and you know, you back up and think about it, and you see these maps. England and France are not that far apart. Planes can fly over, they photograph everything. But it was one of the best kept secrets as to where. And this is jumping ahead just a little bit, but so I have read, and it makes sense to me, had the Germans known exactly where we were coming, they would have had all those panzer divisions, which are tanks and infantry working together. Mm-hmm. They would have had them there, but nobody, first of all, didn't think anybody in the right mind would try to invade France in weather like that. Mm-hmm. And the second thing, they thought it would be near Dunkirk, or where they had tried to once before, and it was a real fiasco for the British.
They were waiting for Patton, weren't they?
Well, could be, could be. So anyway, then we all shape up, and nobody go to shore again then. And then the next day, on the day of the 5th, we leave England. And all you can just see them, all ships coming from everywhere, Portsmouth, Falmouth, Plymouth, all of us are coming together. And it's my recollection, which is not real accurate, that our first course that the lead ships, flotilla commanders were taking, would have headed us toward Dunkirk, somewhere to the east of Normandy. And then somewhere, boom, the direction, the steering is changed, heading right towards the beach, as fast as we could go. And just skimming over it in a hurry, the things that had to be synchronized. The bombers, the planes they were supposed to do a saturation bombing an hour before we were to hit the beach. And of course, they could have just stayed in England for all the good they did. The weather was such, they didn't hit anything. All the pillboxes were still intact, and it wasn't their fault. I mean, it was not the flyboys, but they couldn't see anything. And some of the bombs were dropped over the ocean. So, but as a result, we had to wait for them to clear out. And plus the weather, everything was about an hour late. We were supposed to, what I was told, we were to hit the beach at 5 o'clock in the morning. Now, over there, they're on what you call double British daylight saving time. So, you see, that would make it dark. I remember it was just dark as pitch when they launched us. And that, I'll have to say, when you just measure fear or unknown or whatever, the thing that really makes your heart pound, launching the 4 that came off our LSD into the water, about 2 miles, or at least 2 miles off the shore, because LSTs didn't go until later because they were too valuable to run. And but about time the craft was lowered into the water, he'd come up a big wave, would slap us against the ship, it would roll the other direction. We were just like a yo-yo. And we get one cable off of the LCVPs and one remains. All at once your boat's standing upon its end, you might say. It was rough. Unlike the North Atlantic, the channel water, when it's rough, it's shorter waves, but the force is fantastic. I mean, it was rough. And that held up the timing of hitting the beach a lot. But we just loaded up with, I guess it was a transport. It could have even been another LSD. Got the Army troops. I never knew why, but it doesn't make any difference. There were 5 sectors, they call them the beaches. To the west, we call them American beaches, Omaha and Utah. Then there's a gap just because of the beach terrain. And then 3 more beaches, Gold, Juneau, and Sword. And I was told that we would go in on Juneau. It all looked alike. But I went in with the British. In other words, there were a lot of Americans and a bunch of LSTs, all mixed together, but we were under the British control, or they were in charge of those beaches. Canadians went in on Sword, Americans and British on Gold and Juneau. And so that was the first thing we did. And the difficulty, which was known, was that the Germans had saturated those beaches with obstacles. You remember when you were a little kid, you played with things they called jacks. You just sort of cross your fingers like that. Well, instead of fingers, these were 6 to 8 feet long I-beams, steel I-beams, right, and welded in the middle, so it made just like a big burr. And at the end of each one, there was a mine. It would sink us, our craft. It did. It sank many of them, but it would more or less, it just, ships as big as an LST, it both explode, but also tear a hole in it running over. And the idea, what I was told personally at the briefing, was that we would go in at what they call high tide. And that only occurs twice a year. It's about 2 feet higher tide than normal. Instead of 18 feet from low to high, it was 20 feet. And I heard the expression, it's called neap, K-N-I-E-P-P-E, I think, neap tide, but whatever. It's twice a year. And if we went in when we were told we would, the small craft like ours, we would go over the tops of those obstacles. See, they were out into the beachway. We'd go over the top. Well, but because of the delay, the tide had already started ebbing, and we could see the darn things. Right. And so all we could do is just try to dodge them. I mean, and it's sort of tough, you know, where the ship doesn't respond real quickly. The craft I was on did not meet any mishap. We got the sides and the bottom damaged at different times, but it stayed afloat until we could repair it. But some of them, of course, blown to smithereens.
And what kind of resistance was being met on the beaches?
Well, since I hadn't been doing this for breakfast every morning, you know, it was the first time I'd been in an invasion, and it looked like to me that the resistance was pretty terrific. But fortunately and unfortunately, it had 2 aspects. The Gold and Juneau beaches were comparatively flat, whereas Omaha was a cliff, you know, beach and then a cliff. So they could see us coming, but we could also, once they got on shore, the tanks and things could move pretty good. And it seemed like to me, I was just looking at carnage, and I honestly, again, one of these thoughts that you'll never get out of your mind. I didn't say anything to any of my men, but about 4 o'clock that afternoon, 5 o'clock, see, it's daylight, so maybe 10 then, I expected to hear a command to abandon the beaches. I mean, it just looked like we were getting slaughtered. And, but then before it got dark, where the Navy part of it had to stop, I realized that instead of these two tanks, the Germans and British tanks, running parallel, shooting at each other, they're back another 100 yards. I mean, it was just a little bit, but I was aware of that. Right. And I knew I'd never seen tanks fighting before, or infantry. And so we didn't abandon. I mean, I really and truly, I thought we get the order to abandon, so we'll go in and pick up the survivors and go back. Well, but you know, that's war. But one thing that I'm sure left an indelible mark on all of us in the kind of stuff that I was doing or we were doing. It involved, I'm not sure it was the first day, I'm inclined to believe it was the second day, D-Day +1. We were called in at different times to take wounded back to hospital ships out in the harbor, in the Bay of Seine, they call it. That's the couple of miles off of the beach or something like that. And they were just stacked like cordwood. And I knew they'd been given morphine because I'd given one of my men who got blown up morphine, and that's great stuff. I mean, for the dying, I tell you. And but they were just stacked up like cordwood in our small craft. And I'll never forget the intensity, the way every guy there who had his eyes open, he was looking right at me or one of my men. And I feel sure they were looking for a sign. Am I going to make it? Am I not? And of course, I told my men, do not talk to them. That'll get your mind off what you're doing, and it's not going to help them. So just stare into space and do your job. But that was a true sad experience. It's worse than looking and seeing people getting blown up and shot and knocked out. Right. It's just seeing a human face, not something in a helmet, but that was one of the saddest.
How do you separate yourself from it?
Well, you'll do it. You'll do it or you'll go nuts. By the time we got overseas, anyone who was likely to crack up had been weeded out. I lost 3 guys in training. One of them literally went off his rocker. I mean, I don't know whatever happened to the kid. And the other 2 were a little older, but you don't want to go into battle. An officer will try to see that these guys get permanent shore duty. Mm-hmm. So when we got overseas, every man I had could take it. Mm-hmm. They were good. They were very good.
Now, how long do you continue this job of taking? Okay,
this for us, and it wouldn't necessarily be the same with every LCVP, but my crews and I stayed operating ship to shore for 6 weeks at least, maybe 8. It seemed like to me it was August, June the 6th. It seemed like to me it was early in August when we got notice one day you'll rejoin your LST. Mm-hmm. And the way we had been living, just sort of hand-to-mouth stealing, but we just stealing rations intended for the Army. You know, we'd take them in later, and we just, it wasn't that bad. I mean, you can eat K rations a long time and survive. And then they anchored a Liberty ship or Victory ship, one of that class. somewhere off the beach, and that was sort of a place where we could go when we could to maybe to sleep a while and to get food. All of it was cooked over steamers. And I never ate a fried anything, all steamed. Spam primarily. That's what spam. Yeah, that's something else. So anyway,
We're about 15 minutes into this last tape. So
okay,
15 minutes.
all right. There, of course, you see the carnage, but I don't know. You don't let that stay with you, except it ought to increase your compassion towards anyone. And I think anyone who's been through a war like that has a greater sense of compassion than they otherwise would have had. Finally, when we were taken back aboard the LST, then we were incorporated into the ship's company. I believe the first thing that I became the assistant first lieutenant. And the first lieutenant on the ship is not a rank, but a function. He's in charge of the ship, maintenance of the hull and the different things. Then you got your engineer in charge of the engines, and gunnery officer in charge of the gunnery and communications. I think that was the first thing I did, which gave me a better understanding of the whole ship and its components. And then the next thing, I was communications officer, and that was another sort of ball of wax. I trained on the job, and you get used to reading your radars and all this stuff. But we were told, and I don't know this for a fact, that our ship made the greatest number of trips across the channel or to Belgium, France. It could have been Cherbourg or what's the other city that held so long? Well, anyway. So.
And is this LST 293?
293, that we were told we made the greatest number of trips across channel from the D-Day until May 8th of 45 when the Germans surrendered. Mm-hmm. And it's 90-something trips. It primarily was testimony to the engineer, the skipper. The ship was taken care of. It didn't have to go in for repairs maybe one time. We were always, you just, Sundays, Mondays, Saturdays, all the same. It's just a day. Mm-hmm. You make your trips to wherever you're going to take troops or tanks or whatever, back to England, repeat the process. So it lasted a long time.
Is there ever a time in here when you feel like, though, that you kind of almost forget that you're in a war?
No, I tell you why. The German submarines were active until the night of May 8th. Again, you're talking about luck. According to the escort vessels, maybe twice, and it happened to other LSTs too. Fortunately, we were empty and riding pretty high in the water, that a German torpedo, went under us. And it clearly would do that if it was in the forward half of the ship, because the bow is always more shallow draft than the stern. It might be empty, might not be over 5 or 6 feet in the water. Mm-hmm. So no, I never had any feeling that this is a piece of cake now. No. It was just as, I don't like to use that term because you get to the place. I did. I prayed like the devil the night. I doubt that I slept at all the night of the Normandy invasion. And I think we all, in our first experiences with serious prayer, we pray for ourselves. Mm-hmm. We do. And somewhere along the way, though, I realized this is unfair. Am I saying, Lord, take somebody else and leave me? No. Then I realized that the only thing worth praying for was, Lord, help me always to do my duty under all circumstances, acquit myself with valor, even if I'm killed. Just that's the only thing I think a serviceman should ask for. Otherwise, I think it's selfish. Before I forget it, I'd like to make one comment about sort of spiritual things that we're talking about our experiences. Now, I was raised a Protestant, and I never had any foxhole conversion, anything like that, never in my life. It's maturity, I hope, but not any real conversion. But I had been with an officer in training, and we got to chatting one day, and we just like people do. Well, what you gonna do when the war is over? And he said, well, I want to go to divinity school. I want to be a minister. Well, I knew he was a little different from most of them. He's just a little nicer, a little better, just a great guy, handsome. And I found out, I didn't see him get killed, but I found out he was killed. And I wasn't. I never shed blood anywhere except maybe a little shrapnel that nicked my face, but nothing, nothing. And my conclusion from my own life or my own attitude is that I don't think the Lord is out there active and he selects people who are going to get killed. That wouldn't be the Lord that I think I know, because there's no reason, no logical reason to take this guy and to spare me. I was just a typical reprobate young man at that time, and I didn't have many salvation points built up. But I'll never forget my feeling of, and I still feel that way. As much as I believe in the hereafter, the conventional Protestant Lord, or whatever you want to put it, I just can't believe that the Lord reaches down and snatches this guy. He has him blown up, and he picks me to be saved. I don't know. Maybe I'll never know, but I just don't feel that that would be fair, and I think my God is fair. So is he just saying, I think he just says, hands off. These idiots down there, they fight these wars, they take what comes, but I'm not going to reach down and separate them.
Right.
One thing I would like to mention, because it's another very impressive thing. We, just again, it's pure chance it happened, but we were on our way back from Cherbourg, I believe. Le Havre, maybe, I'm not sure which port. And during the night, and I think that would have been the 7th when we left the French coast, May 7th, because May 8th is considered VE Day, Victory in Europe. And we got this message that the Germans had capitulated, but it said, keep your blackouts, because we don't know that submarines have gotten that message yet. And we were the first warship back in Southampton Harbor after that had been announced. And it just happened we were in tied up to a pier, very, very accessible to the mainland there. And we were asked, I don't know whether it's the 8th that day, possibly was the 9th of May, to have what you'd call an open house so civilians could see what it was like inside these ships that they had been seeing operating in and out for a year and a half or something. And something happened again that I'll never, ever forget. I mentioned how my hat's off to the privations that the British had to go through. And this is a civilian person, a man and his wife. And I don't know why he wasn't in the military. That doesn't make any difference. But had a little girl that I would say that she was probably 6 years old, certainly not over 7. And we had these different things laid out. You know, we Americans always flaunted their luxuries, I reckon. I remember it's some oranges and on a table or something. And I heard this little girl say to her mother, said, "Mommy, you remember I once had an orange." And tears came to my eyes, and it just about does now. That, just think, here this little girl had remember she once had an orange. And that pretty much described it. Fish and chips, yes, but the English didn't eat many good steaks or fresh eggs and all the stuff that we had. And it was just an event that it was sort of, that's the last of the war days that I went through there, and that was just an experience that I'll never forget.
Hold on a second.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Well, after that event of open house, don't know what we did for a while, but there was a lot of sort of going around and picking up stuff, moving from one place to another. And then we were sent to Germany, to Hamburg, to pick up some English troops, I think, what we did. Took them to Norway, way up at Trondheim, and what did I say was the Norwegian city. Anyway, the land of the midnight sun. Then from there, we more or less sort of wrapped up things and headed back to the United States. And you talking about the difference between coming the southern route back home, where the water was on the whole pretty calm, and going over the northern route. It was gravy, I tell you, it was great. And we got back to the States, and some of them were immediately reassigned, and but pretty soon I began to get in touch with the lady, girl that I later married, and we've been married now 57, almost 58 years, with 4 children. So, but I think the most significant thing, at least to me, although it's an interesting experience I had at the Bureau of Naval Personnel, grading awards that had been given in the combat and non-combat, but I began to think, what am I going to do? Now this is getting back, I've got to think, this war is over, both wars. And I ran into a classmate ashore in New York City, and I said, Al, what you going to do? And he said, I'm going to law school. Law school? Well, at that time, I thought to get into any graduate school, you had to be an all-A undergraduate student. Well, he said, what you going to do? I said, I don't know. I've been thinking about staying in the Navy, but it's no place if you're going to get married. And I said, I do want to sooner or later. So anyway, I began to think about that. I went back to my quarters that night, and sure enough, I thought, well, I need more education. I couldn't even remember what I'd taken in undergraduate school. I had thought nothing about academics for these many, many moons. Now I've got to get with the real world. So I applied to Columbia. I was accepted, but by this time, no, I'm not going to live in New York City for 3 years. And wound up simply because I could find a place to live in Nashville back at Vanderbilt. And so this was a gradual reconversion back into civilian life, serving in Washington. But I wouldn't give anything for the experience that I had. I wouldn't want to repeat it. I have no desire ever to do that. Don't recommend it to anyone else. But if you go through a war and you survive and you're not badly crippled, you'll never be the same person again. You're either going to be better or you're going to be worse. I think I'm better. I do. Maybe the Lord did save my fanny for a purpose. I hope He did. But anyway, the conversion back it was tough. Now, mind you, going through law school, we had a GI Bill, but my wife, of course, worked to get me through. And at the time, I had wanted to, even after law school, go to business graduate school of some sort, just because I liked that. But first child was born as a sophomore in law school, so we my wife said, "There goes your master's in business." So it wasn't a bad life, and I say I wouldn't want to repeat it, but I wouldn't have changed. I never thought about not going in, trying to stay out. If I had to go over again, it'd be the same.
Okay. Now, we've got about a minute left. Do you
All right.
keep in touch with anyone still, or any reunions?
We are having a reunion. It's just called the Tennessee Crew or something like that. People who are in the Amphibian Corps at any time. Some man in Cleveland, Tennessee, sort of got together a group, but very few are anywhere near my age. 2 or 3 were in the Normandy area, and I haven't met them yet. And some of them are here in Chattanooga. Hickson, is surprising how many people served in the Amphibian Corps. Before, it was pretty much disbanded. I doubt that there is any Amphibian Corps today.
Well, we've got about 10
Yep.
seconds left, so I just want to thank you for coming in. I appreciate you.
It's been my pleasure. Thank you.